and welcome to everyone to Precog Time episode 6 with Umber Majeed. We're so happy that you could join us today, Umber. And Umber is an amazing artist working across mediums: sculpture, video, virtual, I don't even know what the word is right now, but virtual mediums. Whose latest piece, Trans Pakistan Zindabad, is amazing, and was also, we featured excerpts of at least some of the imagery in the latest issue of Precog magazine, and Umber also contributed a piece to Bubble Orchestra, our virtual downloadable module that can be found, we collaborated on with a virtual dream center, Nicholas Steindorf, who's one of the geniuses behind it, is in the conversation or in the Zoom room right now. And anyway, I'll show you that later, and it's downloadable on the Virtual Dream Center's website. But we just wanted to say hi, welcome Umber, welcome all of you, and just sort of first check in and ask you how you've been and what your life has been like. Umber is our first artist in New York in this series. So yeah.
That's good to know. We're all on the same time zone. That always helps.
That's right.
Quarantine has been quite interesting. We all know what's happening in New York. I think most of the people in the conversation are also New Yorkers. It's been kind of crazy, both like socially and politically, especially in America and generally in America. So it's been lots of a little bit of anger and then a little bit of sadness, but then conversations like this are a little bit hopeful. So, or having opportunities like this is kind of nice to like gather. And yeah, just hoping, as we were talking about before, like just thinking about an imaginary outside of post-COVID maybe is like very important right now. So I'm just trying to gear towards that.
What do you, when you think about your imaginary post-COVID, what does that look like for you?
I think I can imagine that we'll integrate a lot of the performativity of the body post-COVID. So I'm not so sure like social distancing will completely, disappear from how we interact on the street or how we interact with our own bodies, right? Like being aware of like not touching your face, things like that, and how we, interact in social spaces with other people together. Mm-hmm. I think that will be kind of integrated in like strange ways after, the threat.
But also don't you feel like there's a lot of people that are like refusing to wear masks, and then we'll be the opposite, we'll be like really aggressive about trying to touch like each other, or I don't know.
Right. I mean, I don't know if you guys heard of this story, but like it can also be used as like a weapon, which it has been in like protests that are happening across, some parts of the US. But there was a case a few weeks ago, like early in New York, there was a guy who was hoarding medical supplies and the FBI found him. And then they went to his house. It was in South Brooklyn. And he threatened the FBI agents that he had COVID and he would cough all over them to prevent him being arrested. So it's quite strange to see how, because we're not geared towards thinking through the microscopic, to like consider germs and like that as like being present. I think that is what's going to change, whether it'll be used as a weapon or like it will be used as like to show like power, or it being like you trying to protect yourself from, being infected, like overprotecting yourself. So it's gonna be quite strange, and I hope in good ways too. Like politically, it might be interesting what comes out of it, and how essential workers aren't going to take shit anymore, and like you know, low income families and minorities, and all these people like are like, no, the conditions that were normalized are now extreme in the case of like during COVID and like quarantining. So now when we go back to, let's try to go back to a new normal. So I don't know, big things.
Yeah. And Umber, both of your parents got sick, right? In early April?
Yeah. So I mean, they're better now and they're recovering, but it's been quite a journey of like learning to accept the fact that even if you need medical attention, priorities are set, and what those priorities are and who those priorities are kind of, it's like a huge ethical thing. So my parents weren't able to get medical attention immediately, and they had to go to a private hospital and spend thousands of dollars to be able to have access to an oxygen tank, to breathe, you know? So and it doesn't help that you're a minority. It doesn't help. All these things matter. These things are more pronounced even now. But they're recovering, and I'm hoping that I can see them at some point in the near future.
That's good. And because you work a lot with your family, and a lot of your work has to do with your family, right?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I've used a lot of, not just like my family members as performers. The image that you used to promote this event is actually a still where of both my father and my brother, and I've used them as like amateur performers and also like production team, like they're my camera people. I'm like, help me, like either they're holding up signs in the background and I have to read stuff while I'm performing, or so they've been like really great as part of my team. But it's also interesting because I'm interested, a lot of my work has somehow like transformed into a kind of intergenerational dialogue. So a lot of the work that I do is considering the perspective of being a child of immigrants, but also in conversation with like my other generations that I'm in dialogue with and what that means. And so it kind of led me towards the things that I'm pursuing now, which is one, which I came about, which was my grandfather's photographic archive. And so I ended up in the past 3 years doing an immense amount of research, both in terms of this archive, which is like analog prints that my grandfather produced and collected and organized. And then the fact that I couldn't have access to it, he was diagnosed with dementia when I was very young. And so throughout his life and throughout me growing up, I didn't really have access to certain information. So not only was I trying to get information from like what was available to me through like my parents and their experience, but it was also a kind of questioning of history and memory and like how the results of that, whether it's through these like photographic prints of my grandfathers, or through kind of my parents' experience, or through my own body as, you know, also a South Asian woman. And those things are the things that kind of push some of my work.
That's great. That seems like a really good segue to show maybe a couple of clips together of your previous work, just so people who aren't as familiar have more of a sense of what you're working on. So we'll start with the video that I screen shared a still of. We'll watch a little bit of that, and maybe you can talk a little bit about it, and then we'll watch a section from Memories Fade but Photographs Shouldn't. And is that is that I'm
Yeah.
is that some of the archival research? Did that come into That's great. Okay, perfect. So let's take it away. And so this is a piece called Body of Water. And so is this the first time that your brother and father were in one of your pieces, or is this sort of mark the beginning of that, or had you been working with them for a long time?
I worked with my father for a photographic series which mimicked some like art historical paintings, but this is the first kind of moving image work that I did, like video.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so it was also an interesting time. Just so anyone who knew me at the time while I was producing work, we have some people in here. I actually, what was interesting was I was handicapped at that time. I broke my ankle.
Mm.
So I'm actually taking a video while in a wheelchair. So what was interesting through that experience was being able to I use my body in a lot of my previous or like my earlier works.
Mm.
And so this was the first time I was able to use my family members. And it was also interesting because this is kind of a more fluid way of how I was working with a green screen technique.
Mm.
It was a lot of experimentation, and it ended up being an interesting experiment in terms of performance. So the video is about 10 minutes long. We just showed you a tiny excerpt.
Yeah.
And so as you watch the video, the green screen doesn't just hold like a position as like a desired background or a playful displacement. It ends up being, through the performance of my family members, it ends up being a different kind of reality. Their movements of their body ends up trying to cement a kind of transcendence.
Mm.
But every time that they move, it kind of also kind of unfolds, or it like folds up and you can't see the image. So it ended up being a really interesting experiment on looking at this act of particularly like swimming and movement, and how using this kind of digital technology, how like the illusion of transcendence is embedded. I mean, we all are living these like kind of like digital lives now. And so that's also a kind of big part of it that I was thinking about.
Yeah, oh no, go ahead.
Yeah, no, sorry.
I was just gonna say, like as I watched that video, it made me think about like exactly what you were talking about in relationship to desire, like the way green screens symbolize a kind of desire for whatever, for like total openness and freedom of background and situation, but also that it could like be this projective screen for the desire of a performer. but
Right.
also just like watching their movements like highlighted how much work goes into the illusion or something, you know, that like even pretending to swim is hard. um, and it felt like that was also a really important part of the like that durational element of watching the film.
And it's also interesting because the excerpt that you chose is kind of like more in the beginning, but by the end, which is like 10 minutes, you can see how exhausted certain bodies are. So it's like, my father's older, right? So it's like his body is like slower and his like movements are even more slow paced. And then whereas my brother is like speeding up because he's just like super impatient, you know? So it's also kind of like, I mean, it was a happy coincidence, but it became an interesting conversation, even in terms of like me directing them beforehand of like their interpretations of what that meant, knowing for how long they can do it for. But it's absolutely what you're talking about, like the labor behind kind of digital desires are material. They seem like they're seamless, and no, there's a labor behind that. And yeah, there's also politics that are attached to that. Yeah.
Talk about your grandfather's archive and
Yeah.
his tourism agency.
Yeah. So
Okay.
speaking of labor of an image, I came by my grandfather's archive when I visited his home when he was sick, and I started it as a personal project, but it ended up entering my practice. I was interested in the immense amount of copies and photographs he had, and he used, as the years went by and his dementia got worse, photography was one of the things that he held on to. Like, he would photograph incessantly. And so I found these photographs that were quite interesting that I became interested in the archive, thinking of like memory, dementia, and then also its relationship to architecture. And so I came by his photographs of this mosque called the Faisal Mosque, which is a national monument. It's a national building in Islamabad, where he lives. So he would go on trips with my brothers, not me, my brothers, and he would take them to this site and he would photograph it and photograph them there. I did not know that he photographed when it was being built, which was in the 1980s. And I found all this crazy documentation that doesn't even exist in state archives, because I was doing state archival research in Islamabad at that time. So I found this building that my grandfather was interested. I was very interested in how it ended up being. The monument itself was an amalgamation of like a strange nationalism. It was funded by Saudi Arabia, and it was designed by a Turkish architect, and it looked like a tent in the middle of South Asia. It has nothing to do with South Asian architecture. There's no semblance of like the history of like Islamic South Asian architecture, and yet it encompasses both kind of the global money, the kind of international relationships that that Pakistan had with the rest of the world, and to a distorted idea of the Islamic Republic, which was prolific in the 80s. It was the beginnings of Islamization. So all those things, those politics, are captured in these really strange photographs that one man took just visiting the mosque every few days for just like photography trips. Okay. And so, using his personal perspective, and the kinds of angles and photographs he used, I created an animation out of that. And that's when I started being interested in using particular histories or photographs or particular narratives that start from a kind of family semblance, but then also talk about like a larger political project.
Can we watch?
Yeah, we're gonna show it now. Yeah. Alrighty. Gonna start a little bit in the middle.
Yeah, it's funny when I show this video because I've shown it in a couple of different places, and everyone's just like, "Oh my God, is that Islamabad?" Because that place looks it looks nothing like that now. It's like totally gentrified, and like the built environment is very different now.
That's like an almost perfect segue into another question that we were thinking about a lot in relation to your work, which was how important not just architecture but urban planning is to a sense of place, and also like the kinds of experiences that you talk about. Like I know in the piece for Precog, Zamin, it's based on a roundabout, you know, and that maybe speaks to like the gentrification that you're talking about occurring. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your relationship to urban planning and architecture, and like maybe also how that relates to your like your use of diagrams in your work as well.
Right. So I think for the last few projects, I mean, emanating from the piece that you just saw, I am obsessed with architecture and urban planning. After this project, I ended up looking at the urban plan, the history of the urban plan in Islamabad, which was also not built by a Pakistani. It was built by Konstantinos Doxiadis, a Greek urban planner who also was funded by Ford Foundation in the US and decided to build a bunch of strange buildings and planned cities in Beirut, in different parts of the Manasa region, Middle East, North Africa, South Asia region. There's a lot of facts, interesting stuff that culminates into a sense of creating, you know, cities and the histories attached to that, and also the politics attached to that, like where it's inspired from. So for me, I ended up in the project that you're mentioning, Zameen.com. I was obsessed with looking at the absurd architecture in this housing community called Baria Town in Lahore, Pakistan. And essentially, it's a corrupt housing community that has gentrified villagers out. And there's a very interesting relationship of land politics in Pakistan, which is a combination of military rule, like consequences of military rule. So like the military owns a lot of land, and also the uprise of kind of private corporations. So in that, I use Pakistan mostly because I have that information and context. And so in the project, I am using a feature called a roundabout. I mean, it is prominent in the United States as well. I think in other states, like outside of New York, I've heard that it's, I think, in like the Midwest. And so roundabouts are basically interesting architectural features because they're for cars, and they're about kind of having negotiation, right? So it's like all these cars trying to come together, and they have to stop and wait and negotiate who goes first. So that sense of negotiation is quite interesting. Just like in Eyal Wisman, member of Forensic Architecture, who started Forensic Architecture, has a whole book about it called Roundabout Revolutions, which I heavily take from. And it's also a space for protests. In the last 10-15 years, there have been protests in the Manasa region. And so that's where protests take place. So it's a place for gathering. Not only is it a place for negotiation, it's a place for gathering. So what does it mean if a roundabout is embedded in the urban plan in a corrupt housing community that is basically catered to the upper middle class of Pakistan? And what does that mean for the people who occupy those spaces? In my research, a lot of them have been domestic workers and people who've been gentrified out of the lands that they essentially now work for. So that kind of power dynamic and relationship is like kind of played out in this scenario in the urban plan. And so the project Zameen.com is using recreating an alternative roundabout and trying to find a way to access, if not through digital or virtual tools, to renegotiate or rethink what a roundabout could be. And it uses the context of gentrification in Pakistan and this very specific case study, but it can also be talked about in general. And I think it's an important question because a lot of the backlash of the project Zameen.com and the project that is part of Bubble Orchestra is like, but digital tools, virtual tools are very isolating. How can you experience a roundabout like in isolation? Hi, y'all. We're all in isolation. Like it's embedded now into kind of social vocabulary now. So like, what does that mean? So I'm kind of like use that, or I'm thinking about those things now in kind of a different context. But also just to give a little background, I know we have to move on, but this project, or the Zameen.com, kind of came out of, again, a family narrative, which was based on my maternal uncle's failed tourism company. So I basically used I mean, his tourism company failed due to the implications of war on terror, because most foreigners would come to Pakistan and, you know, do hiking at K2 or like go see the mangroves or things like that, nature trips, adventure trips. So now, since, you know, post-war on terror, he had to close his company down. So what I'm interested is using leisure or like this tourism company as an empty signifier to be able to talk about these things, about gentrification, about military rule, about the implications of that, about protest culture that are super loaded. Like, what are the ways in which you can be like also submersive about it? Subversive about it, not submersive, subversive.
Yeah.
And because these are charged topics, and
Can we see a little bit of the virtual dream center again?
Yeah, of course. I was just gonna say that, especially thinking about and I know we'll watch a little clip of this of the Trans-Pakistan piece later, but the idea of the tour guide or the travel guide is like this perfect format for rehistoricizing, because it assumes that your audience doesn't know the history, and so it puts the guide in the position of telling us how it is as though it was always that way, while people who know more about specific context will understand the revision, which is fascinating. But okay, sorry, you it's going to take a second to open the.
I'd also like to mention, so this came, so this came out of the context, you can go ahead and play it, but this came out of the context of Beria town is also known to have actual tourist monuments. So in the corrupt housing community, they actually remade the Eiffel Tower and a Statue of Liberty and all these things. So you'll be able to see photos of it
and walk towards the center. This is a call to walk up to the screen, collapsing the atmospheric with the interior through the body. Break down the divad, the walls. Follow the audio instructions to walk counterclockwise. Face the right for the right to occupy the roundabout. Turn the submersive narrative into your map. Your body is designed. Please start walking around the roundabout against the urban plan and state surveillance. Gouge up enough fluid from your body. Spit into the black water that you are surrounded. Carry on walking now, as slow as you can, to take in all of the sight that is soon to be cultivated. Let it seep in, over the sea, into an overseas enclave. The collapse, trouble finding signals, scrambled, dislocation as location, be diverted. Excuse me? I'm sorry. I don't understand you. I can't hear you. I beg your pardon? I don't know. Who walk up to the screen? Trans-Pakistan is offering an alternative perspective on urban design and sociality. We are looking at subjectivities commissioned by Bahia Town, but created by local artisans, who are also the displaced from the gated community. These subjectivities they create leave as residues of the emerging Umber Tohi Block Dunya by Bahia Town. Loiter
Umber, sorry, you were talking about that they had their own Eiffel Tower. What else did they have? Like their own?
They have their own reproductions of an Eiffel Tower. As they made an ancient Egyptian themed sector of the housing community. There's no pyramids, but they refer to it as the ancient Egypt of Islamic civilization. That's what they name it. So it's a very strange amalgamation of Islamic Orientalism, ancient Egyptian civilization, and modern architecture. And it's mostly at these roundabouts. So most people that are not residents, the only access they have is through these tourist monuments. And so they're actually function as tourist monuments. You have to buy a ticket, and there's like a small Eiffel Tower. It's not that small, but you can actually pay to get on and go in an elevator to the top. And when you get to the top, you get to see houses of beige. Like, that's the view. The view is seeing the rest of the housing community and sea of beige houses that look all the same. So it's quite interesting how the monuments become mechanisms to just perpetuate that like neoliberal logic. And
They
also
have that in China too, though, right? Like
yeah, but that was failed. That was
it's like abandoned, right?
It was abandoned. This housing community is thriving. They're opening new branches in all these metropolitan cities all over Pakistan. Wow. And the reason is their funding is coming from diasporic Pakistanis. So Pakistanis who live abroad, who've made money. So I did this whole research, like a lot of the research behind this project is also taken from Amara Maqsood, who's a theorist, and she wrote a book called The New Pakistani Middle Class. And she talks about a kind of return migration of Pakistanis who have left Pakistan and moved to the Gulf or moved to the United States or Northern Europe. And they ended up post 9/11 returning back to a country like Pakistan or other parts of the world and sending money. So they're an important economy, and that's actually an economy that the current government in Pakistan is trying to tap into to create state infrastructure. So it's a lot of like interesting global, local tensions.
And a lot of your work also takes like the form or format of state-sponsored speech. Like it feels like, especially in some of the visuals that you have, and I'll pull up a couple of them so people can see. But you kind of quote like PSAs or posters, and it's sort of like in between. Some of them feel as though they're in between a conspiracy theory and like a state-sponsored speech. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that as well. Sorry, I have to get out of here. Like, and I'm thinking specifically of maybe not
this project.
I think my neighbors by now, they're so tired of me. I probably have to give them a thank you note or something.
What's happening? Sorry, y'all.
They're so sweet though.
What is this? I don't know what's happening. I don't know. Sorry, hold on. I'm gonna mute. Okay. I think like
that's not my practice, y'all.
Maybe one of the Vimeo. That's what happened. The Vimeo spilled.
You told me about this before we started recording.
Okay.
You took the wrong link.
No, it was the it was the Vimeo from the other from your film, like auto-played into the next.
Yes. Oh,
what happened again? Okay, we'll share again. And so I was thinking about these images, facts about the Earth.
No, the artist of the month, or were you thinking about this is my website?
Yeah, this is your website, but I was sort of thinking about these images.
Yeah.
And thinking about like the relationship to political speech / conspiracy theories, and whether that's something that you think about. I'm going to scroll through these as well. So
okay. So I source a lot of my material, like visual material, from, as I said, the archives. So it's either letters that my grandfather had. He kept a lot of stuff. And the tourism material, a lot of that is from promotional materials from the failed companies. So I took a lot of that, and those are the visuals that, let's say, you would see in some of the posters. But the project that you were scrolling through before, the green project, it's, yeah, this one. That the entire project is narrativized by a fictional author and a fictional character, which is supposed to be a male poet, and the whole project is around nuclear nationalism, and the voice embodies kind of the perspective of state bureaucracy. And so in the project, or in the video pieces, part of the project, there's a I do the voice of the male poet, and I overperform it. So I think what you were mentioning before about being in dialogue or using the visuals of kind of state bureaucracy is like an active tool to be able to like acknowledge that state propaganda and bureaucracy uses these ideas of visuality and religiosity and kind of history as like propaganda to further like strain like really messed up policies. And so if I take those very similar visual tools or ideas and kind of turn it on its head, what would that look like? So that's a lot of the logic. And then there's like my own personal aesthetic, which is like, you can see my background. It's like indulgence of like color and like media and clashing all these different sources. I mean, if you look at my hard drive, there's just like folders and folders upon stock images. And those images mean something. And I would take them, let's say for one of my projects, I followed a Facebook group that was promoted by Pakistani military officers, and they made terrible memes about nuclear nationalism because there's a holiday that happens every year. So they posted all these terrible memes, and all of those memes entered like my video. I animated them even more, but it's like, it's all part of it.
Can you talk a little bit about being a woman, and because, you know, how do you get access to these places that you want to, you know, go film and all these things? Like, what's it like for you?
Oh, I don't get access to those places. So
yeah, are you?
I've been kicked out.
Okay.
I'm not just, the barriers that I have for my research are not just that, not to generalize ever about anyone's experience in South Asia, but my experience is because I am also a woman, I don't dress the way most Pakistani women in public space dress and I have an American accent. Those are a lot of like social barriers for me to go to state offices. Also, the fact that I'm an artist, it's not a clear job. Why do I need this archive material from the state archive, right? Like, am I a news person that's going to like reveal a story that the state office didn't do this? So I got kicked out of state municipalities because I photographed they destroyed a state monument, and I went to go research and get information, and I found the rebel of the destroyed monument as I was walking out, and I just took out my camera and I just was going to take a quick picture, and there was a riot in the front. They kicked me out. And this is even though I had governmental connections, like my father knew some official who gave me access to have a meeting with the person. So it's a lot. When I speak about being subversive, that is just the only way for me to be able to do these projects. Even for Behria Town, the only reason that I keep referring to throughout the project, I keep referring to the technology in the mobile phone, in a cell phone is because that's the only device that you are allowed to take in the housing community that the security will not take away from you. I wasn't allowed to take a camera. They also assumed I was a resident, and when I was photographing different parts of the roundabouts, they questioned me and I needed to get a permit. I went to the office, they wouldn't give me a permit because I wasn't a resident and I wasn't an official. So it's using the inability to access certain information or knowledge is both like consequence of like who I am as a person and what my relationship is to like my economic status or my nationality. But it is also the fact, I don't know how to, it's about being diasporic also. So how can I play with that, you know? And that mistranslation or inability to access information becomes like a method of like, okay, what is the way, if that is your logic, that I need to be these things, then how can I circumvent that? And so the project for Town is trying to find a way to use leisure, a tourism company, to, as a Trojan horse, to be able to access this community, this housing organization. So I can get in real big trouble if if I'm not careful of where I show this project, how I show it, and where I get the funding from for it. So it comes from like me as a person, but there's also all these like other infrastructures that come to play, and I am aware of it, and I try to be as careful as I can as an artist.
That's so intense, Umber.
Yeah.
Also, I talk to other artists in Pakistan. There's amazing, really critical artists. Like there's the Tentative Collective and based in Karachi, and they also do great, like really great projects around missing peoples in Karachi. And there's a whole like against the military. They do these projects that investigate that, and they also do a project on Town, but in Karachi. There's a Karachi branch. They're in trouble because they live there. You know, they like their events can get canceled, their exhibitions can get canceled, they can get surveillance against them, all these things. And it's like, I had a conversation with one of them and they were just like, yeah, it's great, I wish I could do the things that you can do. I'm like, yeah, it's possible for me because I live in Lahore, but I don't live there throughout the year, and I've more and more spent more time in New York.
And
yeah.
Umber, how has that changed now that we don't know when we're going to be able to travel again, and all your work has been like such a back and forth from going back there, coming, and now we're here. Like, so is that making you rethink things, or what are you thinking about right now?
I mean, even though the context or the case study is specifically looking at Pakistan, I think it's been much more important for me to use Pakistan as just like a jumping off point, or like to be so specific and get all the information and facts that I can to then talk about it in a more regional context. So the conversations that I'm having around gentrification in Town are replicated in different parts of the region. So like in Beirut, there are also housing communities, in Palestine, and there's a lot of different projects, and in Egypt especially. In Egypt, in Cairo, there's a lot of housing projects that come from the logic of Town. So I think it's not a thing about like, oh, and how am I going to have access to that space? I think it's now for me an opportunity to reframe the conversation in a more with a global audience. I always thought about that in terms of a lot of the projects, some parts of it is like very specific. Like I don't translate a lot of things that are, if I use Urdu, I don't feel the need to translate a lot of things. So it has an insider outsider thing to actually experience the work. But in terms of making the work, I think I've shown most of my work abroad because of how, and the conversations I have are more outside of Pakistan than it is within. So as I mentioned before in the beginning of this conversation, in the beginning of this talk, that I'm rethinking ways of protest culture and like what to do, what that would look like now, and how digital services mean something else now in all of us in isolation. I want to build upon that and have more conversations about that.
So we have,
and I think it's also, sorry, just
no, go ahead. Yeah.
but like, it's also my entire project of looking at digital networks. The most recent project is based off of an India media theorist's idea of pirated networks. So there's a book called by Ravi Sundaram. He's an India media theorist. His book is called Pirate Modernity. He specified that the kind of digital networks that are or pirated digital networks that are visible in South Asia are specific to the region. So pirated Bollywood cassettes and DVDs, you know, that's a very specific kind of network that is outside of state censorship. And how does this kind of material and kind of culture, how is it disseminated? So I'm trying to draw from that kind of perspective. And maybe this is an opportunity to take something that is very specific to South Asia, or the idea of like piracy and censorship, and not refashion, that sounds weird, but like think about it in like this context in other parts of the world.
Should we do questions? Is
Yeah,
there anyone?
we have a couple questions that have come in. If anybody has any others, send them over through the chat. But Claire had two questions.
Thanks, Claire.
The first is, I think, a little bit sort of topically related, which is, so does your tourism company function as both subject matter, right? Subject matter, and an alter ego of sorts? And are you using the company name to justify or explain need for access? And how does that relate to this idea that it could be your alter ego in a sort of way?
Thank you, Claire, for this really, really good question. So the project name is Trans Pakistan Zindabad. Translated, it means long live Trans Pakistan. So the slogan for Pakistani nationalism is Pakistan Zindabad. So I'm playing on a kind of national motif and using it in the context of Trans Pakistan. Also the term Trans Pakistan, it's also kind of like beyond Pakistan, which is also something my uncle came up with. I didn't, but I think it's fantastic. So Trans Pakistan digital services, or this like reboot, is definitely, I consider, an alter ego. Thanks, Amal. Is definitely an alter ego, and it's a kind of a shell company taking on kind of the mechanisms of a corporate tourism company, but using it as a way to be able to talk about the things that I want to talk about. So, yeah. So, is there anything else that I didn't answer?
No, I think Claire had another question though, in relationship to one of the earlier videos, but I think still sort of applies in general, which is your sound sourced as well? And if so, I know you do a lot of recordings, but in the video photographs fade, memories fade, photographs shouldn't. You use a lot of, there's like birds chirping and other sound elements, and we are all wondering where the sound comes from and how you think about that.
So I use a lot of stock sound, and I'm so sorry, they're like making, can you hear it?
Yeah, it's the
7 o'clock.
7.
Everyone in New York. Yeah. So they're using, I use a lot of stock sound, but I also use, I'm so sorry.
No.
I ended up using a lot of voiceover for a lot of my later works, because I also give performance lecture with some of my animations, and I share research. So that's the kind of sound that I'm really use and I'm interested in. And I think when kind of going back to the first question of like alter ego, when I give certain voiceovers, I obviously embody a kind of different tone. So for the tourism company, I am a representative of Trans Pakistan, and I like full on go into kind of like show person mode. And then as you watch the animation or you experience a lecture performance, that slowly unfolds with the content. So it's a lot of play between different kinds of characters, but it's like very subtle. It's not like a huge kind of break. And I think, again, back to subversity, I think I'm more interested in that. Cool. I hope that answered your question, Claire. Or some of it, yeah.
Claire says, maybe I misunderstood the function of using the company as you're doing research in state archives. If artist is not an acceptable employee, perhaps tourism agent is.
Yeah. I think the tourist, I think it's a fine line between kind of, because I play a couple different roles. So Trans Pakistan is like company, then I also play tour guide, then I also play kind of travel agent, tourist agent. So there's a couple of different roles that I'm interested in playing in, and they're all used in different ways in the overall project. So the virtual reality is like embodying the tour guide aspect completely. And then in the animation, it's more of like a promotional agent. And so it's like wearing all the little different kind of corporate hats and seeing how they function.
But you wouldn't be able to get access, like in your research, you wouldn't be able to like say that you're a tourist agent with your uncle's company in order to just get access to the resources, right?
So that's, I think, one of the next steps in my project, which I was supposed to have a solo show on April 3rd. That did not happen. But I was looking into trying to actually get the rights to Trans Pakistan given to me, and then using and kind of trying to establish it as a legitimized company. So then if I were to ever go back, I could use it as a tool to get information. I mean, I would have to like show evidence, like create a website and like specific to Trans Pakistan. I mean, it would all be part of the project, right? And it would be really owning the company for what it is. And yeah, so those are the next steps if to pursue this project, is to think about really owning that voice, and then using it. Like, this is the base of the project. We're looking at Barrier Town, right? I mean, I could expand also. So yeah.
So I think we're getting pretty close to the end. I'm going to unmute everyone. Thank you so much, Umber. This is amazing. But I think as like a kind of final question, or I'll allow everyone to unmute themselves, and please feel free to hang and talk for a while. But we were wondering if you could talk a little bit about your inspirations, and if you have any quarantine inspirations you want to share with us.
Inspirations. Well, this is kind of a hard one because I'm not really usually I get a lot of inspiration just by like ingesting so much like visual content, like looking at a lot of really interesting imagery. I was saying before that I have like just so much random like stock images just on my desktop, or and just collecting weird objects. Whenever I travel, I always bring back really weird things. And so I don't know, I think now that I'm having this time in isolation, I'm just trying to regroup. So I'm like cleaning out my home studio and just looking through all of my older references and things and trying to like to make sense of it, because I have a very kind of scattered, intuitive, process of making work. And so I'm very much interested in finding a way of like, how can I look back at this and like, where did I get this from? And so if I take images or drawings or graphs, as you mentioned, diagrams before, Gabby, I use a lot of diagrams, print them out, keep them, scan them, draw them, then print them again, then scan them again, put them animated, and then that is like 2 seconds of an animation, like 2 seconds of my video. So like there is so much content that I've just been like going through, and I kind of want to like revel in it. The other thing that I've been, so I guess inspiration from my own practice, that sounds a little weird, but and second, I've been drawing a lot. So I think I haven't been doing too much body movement right now. Like I haven't been going on walks or exercising enough, which is like terrible, but I've been sitting and like making these intricate drawings that were supposed to supplement my solo show, but are now just existing as pieces. And I'm trying to like enjoy that, have the time to.
Okay, but any good movies?
Oh, okay.
I'm like, Umber, bring it back.
Bring it back.
I'm gonna unmute everyone, and then you can remute yourselves if you want.
I'm just watching so much Netflix, just everything. I have not been watching anything too serious because I think
Hard to focus.
Yeah, it's been hard, like to focus, to like look at dark content. It's freaky to just even look at my Facebook feed, honestly.
Is it really?
So lots of musicals.
Okay.
What else? I have a lot of books that I have queued up that I'm like ready for. So I have a clump of books just like above on my bookcase that are like in a row. And I'm like, I gotta get through these. So I'm excited for that.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah. I don't know. And doing lots of like Zoom conversations, like one-to-one. And has anyone done Hangout? That's a lot of fun.
Like
That's
Google Hangouts?
basically it. Not so exciting.
They
Okay.
figured out
Anyone else want to talk? Kara?
that might be for background noise.
Wait, what?
Google Hangouts, or not Google Hangouts, House Party? Is that what you're asking?
House party. Oops. Yeah, that's what I meant.
Party figured out how to do Pictionary, which is a major achievement or something, where you can like do the drawing and people have to guess what it is. This is what our social life is reduced to. Like, thank you, Claire.
Okay, it's like, bye.
Cool.
Enough.
I think everyone's trying to run to dinner.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
dinner time.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thank
Nick.
you, everyone, for coming by.
Okay, Nick says that was great.
Nice to meet you, Nicholas.
Yeah.
Sorry, my computer's broken. Nick says Nick.
He said his computer's broken?
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay, all right, Nick.
That's so funny.
Cool. We'll get a new one, Nick.
Well, I think we should all go to dinner then.
Yeah.
Because
Thanks for having me, everyone.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you. Umber, to talk to you. I'm excited for
Take care, everyone. Be
when your
safe
show
and healthy.
happens. We'll go, okay?
Keep it real. This is day 55 for me. I don't know what it is for you. Wild, right? 55 days.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Randy.
Bye.